Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we begin The New Science by Giambattista Vico. I am reading from the earliest full unabridged version and translation of this work into English by Thomas Goddard Bergen and Max Harold Fish. Vico does something very interesting. He gives us an image, and it is under this image that he talks about his idea for the work. In fact, it is titled Explanation of the Picture Placed as Frontispiece to serve as introduction to the work. I will go ahead and start reading that, but I would like real quickly to make a couple of comments. I am reading this in good faith as I can. I'm not an expert in pronouncing a lot of these Italian names and places, and there's going to be a lot of Roman, Latin names and Greek, and I'm going to read them as I see them and do my level best to pronounce them the way I think that they're supposed to be pronounced. However, if I was to sit here and look up every single name that he lists and try to find out how to pronounce it, there would just be no end to this because it is a very long work. So I'm going to go through and read it as best I can, and hopefully you will forgive any blunders that you detect in my lack of education in those various languages. The other thing is that this particular edition contains numbered paragraphs, which, if you are looking at this physically, are very, very necessary, very handy, and I'm actually going to be listing those paragraphs off in the description for each video, so you can follow along and see the progression, and maybe if you heard something that you thought was interesting, you can, at least with this particular translation, find it fairly easily. So with that said, I will go ahead and start the work. Paragraph 1. As Cebes the Theban made a table of things moral, we here offer one of things civil. We hope it may serve to give the reader some conception of this work before he reads it, and with such aid as imagination may afford, to call it back to mind after he has read it. Paragraph 2. The lady with the winged temples who surmounts the celestial globe or world of nature is metaphysic, for the name means as much. The luminous triangle with the seeing eye is God, with the aspect of his providence. Through this aspect, metaphysic and the attitude of ecstasy contemplates him above the order of natural things, through which hitherto the philosophers have contemplated him. For in the present work, ascending higher, she contemplates in God the world of human minds, which is the metaphysical world, in order to show his providence in the world of human spirits, which is the civil world, or world of nations. The latter has as the elements of which it is formed all the things represented by the hieroglyphs displayed in the lower half of the picture. The globe, or the physical, natural world, is supported by the altar in one part only, for until now the philosophers, contemplating divine providence only through the natural order, have shown only a part of it. Accordingly, men offer worship, sacrifices, and other divine honors to God as to the mind which is the free and absolute sovereign of nature, because by his eternal counsel he has given us existence through nature, and through nature preserves it to us. But the philosophers have not yet contemplated his providence in respect of that part of it which is the most proper to men, whose nature has this principal property, that of being social. In providing for this property, God has so ordained and disposed human affairs that men, having fallen from complete justice by original sin, and while intending almost always to do something quite different and often quite the contrary, so that for private utility they would live alone, like the wild beasts, have been led by this same utility, and along the aforesaid different and contrary paths, to live like men in justice, and to keep themselves in society, and thus to observe their social nature. It will be shown in the present work that this is the true civil nature of man, and thus that law exists in nature. The conduct of divine providence in this matter is one of the things whose rationale is a chief business of our science, which becomes in this respect a rational civil theology of divine providence. Paragraph 3. In the belt of the zodiac which girds the celestial globe, the two signs of Leo and Virgo, more than the others, appear in majesty, or as is said, in perspective. The former signifies that our science in its beginnings contemplates first the Hercules, that every ancient Gentile nation boasts as its founder, and that it contemplates him in his greatest labor. This was the slaying of the lion, which, vomiting flame, set fire to the Nemean forest, and adorned with whose skin Hercules was raised to the stars. The lion is here found to have been the great ancient forest of the earth, burned down and brought under cultivation by Hercules, whom we find to have been the type of the political heroes who had to precede the military heroes. This sign also represents the beginning of time, reckonings, which among the Greeks, to whom we owe all our knowledge of Gentile antiquity, began with the Olympiads, based on the games of which we are told that Hercules was the founder. They must have begun among the Nemeans to celebrate his victory over the lion he slew. Thus the time, reckonings of the Greeks, began when cultivation of the fields began among them. The second sign, that of the Virgin, whom the astronomers found described by the poets as crowned with the ears of grain, signifies that Greek history began with the Golden Age. The poets expressly relate that this was the first age of their world, when through the long course of centuries the years were counted by the grain harvests, which we find to have been the first gold of the world. This golden age of the Greeks has its Latin counterpart in the age of Saturn, who gets his name from sati, quote-unquote, sown fields. In this age of gold, the poets assure us faithfully the gods consorted on earth with the heroes. For we shall show later that the first men among the Gentiles, simple and crude, and under the powerful spell of most vigorous imaginations encumbered with frightful superstitions, actually believed that they saw the gods on earth. We shall see further that by uniformity of ideas and Orientals, Egyptians, Greeks, and Latins, each in ignorance of the others, afterwards raised the gods to the planets, and the heroes to the fixed stars. Thus from Saturn, whose Greek name Chronos means time, new principles are derived for chronology, or the theory of time. Paragraph 4. You must not think it improper that the altar is under and supports the globe. For it will be found that the world's first altars were raised by the Gentiles in the first heaven of the poets, who in their fables faithfully passed on to us the story that heaven had reigned on earth over men, and had left great blessings to mankind. These first men, children as it were of the growing human race, believed that the sky was no higher than the summits of the mountains, as even now children believe it to be little higher than the roofs of their houses. Then, as the Greek intelligence developed, heaven was raised to the summits of the highest mountains, such as Olympus, where Homer relates that the gods of his day had their dwelling. Finally, it was raised above the spheres, as we are now taught by astronomy, and Olympus was raised above the heaven of the fixed stars. Thither likewise was transported the altar, which is now a celestial sign, and the fire upon it passed into the neighboring house, as you see here of the lion. This, as we have just observed, was the Nemean forest, to which Hercules set fire to bring it under cultivation, for the lion's skin was raised to the stars in token of the triumph of Hercules. Paragraph 5. The ray of the divine providence, illuminating a convex jewel, which adorns the breast of the metaphysic, denotes the clean and pure heart which metaphysic must have, not dirty or befouled with pride of spirit, or vileness of bodily pleasures, by the first of which Zeno was led to put fate, and by the second, Epicurus, to put chance in the place of divine providence. Furthermore, it indicates that the knowledge of God does not have its ending in metaphysic, taking private illumination from intellectual things and thence regulating merely her own moral conduct, as hitherto the philosophers have done. For this would have been signified by a flat jewel, whereas the jewel is convex, thus reflecting and scattering the ray abroad, to show that metaphysics should know God's providence in public morals or civil customs, by which the nations have come into being and maintain themselves in the world. Paragraph 6. The same ray is reflected from the breast of metaphysic onto the statue of Homer, the first Gentile author who has come down to us. For metaphysic, directing a history of human ideas from the beginnings of truly human thinking among the Gentiles, has enabled us to descend into the crude minds of the first founders of the Gentile nations, all robust sense and vast imagination. They had only the bare potentiality, and that torpid and stupid, of using the human mind and reason. For that very reason, the beginnings of poetry, not only different from but contrary to those which have been hitherto imagined, are found to lie in the beginnings of poetic wisdom, which have for that same reason been hitherto hidden from us. This poetic wisdom, the knowledge of the theological poets, was unquestionably the first wisdom of the world for the Gentiles. The statue of Homer, on a cracked base, signifies the discovery of the true Homer. In the first edition of the new science, we sensed it, but did not understand it. In the present edition, it is fully set forth after due consideration. Unknown until now, he has held hidden from us true facts of the fabulous period among the nations, and much more so those of the obscure period which all had despaired of knowing, and consequently the first true origins of things of the historic period. These are the three periods of the world which Marcus Terentius Varro, the most learned writer on Roman antiquities, recorded for us in his great work, entitled Antiquities of Divine and Human Things, which has been lost. Paragraph 7. Moreover, it may here be pointed out that in the present work, with a new critical art that has hitherto been lacking, entering on the research of the truth concerning the authors of these same Gentile nations, among which more than 1,000 years had to pass in order to bring forth the writers with whom criticism has hitherto been concerned, philosophy undertakes to examine philology, that is, the doctrine of everything that depends on the human will, for example, all histories of the languages, customs and deeds of peoples in war and peace, of which, because of the deplorable obscurity of causes and almost infinite variety of effects, philosophy has had almost a horror of treating, and reduces it to the form of a science by discovering in it the design of an ideal eternal history, traversed in time by the histories of all nations. So that, on account of this its second principal aspect, our science may be considered a philosophy of authority. For by virtue of new principles of mythology herein disclosed as consequences of the new principles of poetry found herein, it is shown that the fables were true and trustworthy histories of the customs of the most ancient peoples of Greece. In the first place, the fables of the gods were stories of the times in which men of the crudest Gentile humanity thought that all things necessary or useful to the human race were deities. The authors of this poetry were the first peoples, whom we find to have been all theological poets, who without doubt, as we are told, founded the Gentile nations with fables of the gods. And here, by the principles of this new critical art, we consider at what determinate times and on what particular occasions of human necessity or utility felt by the first men of the Gentile world, they, with frightful religions which they themselves feigned and believed in, imagined first such and such gods, and then such and such others. The natural theogony or generations of the gods formed naturally in the minds of these first men, may give us a rational chronology of the poetic history of the gods. In the second place, the heroic fables were true stories of the heroes and their heroic customs, which are found to have flourished in the barbarous period of all nations, so that the two poems of Homer are found to be two great treasure houses of discoveries of the natural law of nations among the still barbarous Greeks. In the present work, this period of barbarism is determined to have lasted among the Greeks until the time of Herodotus, called the father of Greek history, whose books are for the most part full of fables, and whose style retains very much of the Homeric. This is a characteristic retained by all the historians who came after him, as they used a phraseology halfway between the poetic and the vulgar. But Thucydides, the first scrupulous and serious historian of Greece, at the beginning of his account, declares that down to his father's time, and thus to that of Herodotus, who was an old man when Thucydides was a child, the Greeks were quite ignorant of their own antiquities, to say nothing of those of other peoples, which, apart from the Roman, have all come down to us through the Greeks. These antiquities are the deep shadows which the picture shows in the background, against which there stand forth, in the light of the ray of divine providence reflected by metaphysic upon Homer, all the hieroglyphs which represent the principles, known until now only by the effects, of this world of nations. Paragraph 8. Among these hieroglyphs, the most prominent is an altar, because among all peoples the civil world began with religion, as we have briefly noted a while back, and as we shall shortly observe more fully. Paragraph 9. Upon the altar at the left, the first object we see is a lituus, the staff with which the augurs took auguries and observed the auspices. This signifies divination, from which among the Gentiles the first divine things took their origin. The Hebrews thought God to be an infinite mind beholding all times in one point of eternity, whence God either himself or through the angels that are minds, or through the prophets to whose minds God spoke, gave notice of what was in store for his people. The Gentiles fancied bodies to be gods, that by sensible signs they might give notice of what was in store for the peoples. On account of the attribute of his providence, a true among the Hebrews as it was imagined among the Gentiles, all humankind gave to the nature of God the name divinity, by one common idea, which the Latins expressed in divinare, to foretell the future, but with the aforesaid fundamental difference from which derive all other essential differences shown by our science between the natural law of the Hebrews and the natural law of nations. The Roman jurisconsults defined the latter as having been ordained by divine providence, along with human customs themselves. Thus the aforesaid lituus represents also the beginning of a Gentile universal history, which is shown by physical and philological evidence to have begun with the universal flood. After an interval of 2 centuries, as fabulous history relates, heaven reigned on earth, and bestowed many and great blessings on mankind, and by uniformity of ideas among Orientals, Egyptians, Greeks, Latins, and other Gentile nations, there arose equally the religions of as many Joves. For at the end of this period of time after the flood, heaven must have thundered and lightened, and from the thunder and lightning of its Jove, each nation began to take auspices. This multiplicity of Joves, which led the Egyptians to call their Jove Ammon, the oldest of them all, has hitherto been a marvel to the philologians. The same twofold evidence proves the religion of the Hebrews more ancient than those by which the nations were founded, and hence the truth of the Christian religion. Paragraph 10. On the altar near the lituus may be seen the water and fire, the former contained in a jar. For with a view to divination, sacrifices arose among the Gentiles from that common custom of theirs which the Latins called procurare auspicia, i.e., to sacrifice in order to understand the auguries well, so that the divine warnings or commands of Jove might be properly carried out. These are the divine things among the Gentiles, from which came later all their human things. Paragraph 11. The first of these human things was marriage, symbolized by the torch lit from the fire on the altar and leaning against the jar. For marriage, as all statesmen agree, is the seed plot of the family, as the family is the seed plot of the commonwealth. To denote this, the torch, although it is the hieroglyph of the human thing, is placed on the altar along with the water and fire, which are hieroglyphs of divine ceremonies, just as the ancient Romans celebrated nuptials aqua et igni, because it was understood that by divine counsel these two common things, and before fire even perennial water, as a thing more necessary to life, had led men to live in society. Paragraph 12. The second of human things is burial. Indeed, humanitas in Latin comes first, and properly from humando, quote-unquote, burying. This institution is symbolized by a cinerary urn, placed to one side within the forest, indicating that burial goes back to a time when men ate fruit in summer and acorns in winter. The urn is inscribed D.M., which means to the good souls of the dead. This motto represents the common consent of all mankind, and the opinion later proved true by Plato that human souls do not die with their bodies, but that they are immortal. Paragraph 13. The urn indicates also the origin among the Gentiles of the division of the fields, to which is to be traced the distinction of cities and peoples, and finally of nations. For it will be found that the races first of Ham, then of Japheth, and finally of Shem, without the religion of their father Noah, which they had repudiated, and which alone, and which was the state of nature, could have held them by marriages in a society of families, were lost from one another by roving wild in the great forest of the earth, pursuing shy and indocile women, and fleeing from the wild animals, with which the great ancient forest must have abounded. They were scattered further in search of pasture and water, and as the result of it all were reduced, at the end of a long period, to the condition of beasts. Then, on certain occasions ordained by divine providence, occasions which our science studies and discovers, shaken and aroused by a terrible fear, each of the particular Uranus and Jove had feigned and believed in. Some of them finally left off wondering and went into hiding in definite places. There, settled with particular women, through fear of the apprehended divinity and religious and chaste carnal unions, they solemnized marriages under cover and begat acknowledged children, and so founded families. By long residence and burial of their dead, they came to found and divide the first dominions of the earth, whose lords were called giants, a Greek word meaning children of the earth, i.e., descendants of those who have been buried. Hence they considered themselves noble, justly ascribing their nobility in that first state of human things to their having been humanely engendered in the fear of the divinity. From this manner of human engendering, and not from anything else, what is called human generation took its name. The houses which had branched out into several families thus formed were called the first nations, gentes, because of such generation. As the subject matter of the natural law of nations begins at so early a time, so in this work the doctrine begins there too. This is a third principal aspect under which our science should be viewed. Now there are both physical and moral reasons, apart from the authority of history, to show that the giants must have been of disproportionate strength and stature. Since these reasons did not obtain in the case of believers in the true God, creator of the world, and of Adam, the prince of all humankind, the Hebrews from the very beginning of the world were of proper stature. So after the first principle of divine providence, and the second of solemn matrimony, the universal belief in the immortality of the soul, which had its beginnings in the institution of burial, is the third of the three principles on which this science bases its discussions of the origins of all the innumerable various and diverse things of which it treats. Paragraph 14. From the forest where the urn is placed, a plough stands forth, signifying that the fathers of the first peoples were the first strong men of history. Hence, the founders of the first Gentile nations above mentioned were the Herculeses, of whom Varro counted a good 40, and the Egyptians claimed theirs to be the most ancient. For these Herculeses subdued the first lands of the world, and brought them under cultivation. Thus the first fathers of the Gentile nations, who were 1. Just in virtue of the supposed piety of observing the auspices with which they believed divine commands of Job, from whose Latin name ius came the old word ius for law, later contracted to ius, so that justice among all peoples is naturally taught along with piety. 2. Prudent and sacrificing to obtain or clearly to understand the auspices, and thus take good counsel of what, by the commands of Job, they should undertake in life. And 3. Temperate in the institution of matrimony, were also, as is here indicated, 4. Strong men. Hence, new principles are given to moral philosophy, in order that the esoteric wisdom of the philosophers may conspire with the vulgar wisdom of lawmakers. By these principles all the virtues have their roots in piety and religion, by which alone the virtues are made effective in action, and by reason of which men propose to themselves as good whatever God wills. New principles are given also to economic doctrine, by which sons, so long as they are in the power of their fathers, must be considered to be in the family state, and consequently are in no other way to be formed and confirmed in all their studies than in piety and religion. Since they are not yet capable of understanding commonwealth and laws, they are to reverence and fear their fathers as living images of God, so as to be naturally disposed to follow the religion of their fathers, and to defend their fatherland, which preserves their families for them, and so to obey the laws ordained for the preservation of their religion and fatherland. For divine providence ordained human things with this eternal counsel, that families should first be founded by means of religions, and that upon the families commonwealths should then arise by means of laws. Paragraph 15. The plough rests its handle against the altar with a certain majesty, to give us to understand that ploughed lands were the first altars of the Gentiles, and to denote also the natural superiority which the heroes believed they had over the socii. The latter, as we shall see shortly, are symbolized by the rudder, which is seen bowing near the base of the altar. On this superiority of nature, it will be shown the heroes grounded the law, the science, and hence the administration of divine things, i.e., the auspices which were in their keeping. Paragraph 16. The plough shows only the point of the share and hides the moldboard. Before the use of iron was known, the share had to be made of a curved piece of very hard wood, capable of breaking and turning the earth. The Latins called the moldboard urbs, whence the ancient urbum, quote-unquote, curved. The moldboard is hidden to signify that the first cities, which were all founded on cultivated fields, arose as a result of families being for a long time quite withdrawn and hidden among the sacred terrors of the religious forests. These cultivated fields are found among all ancient Gentile nations, and by an idea common to all, were called by the Latin people luci, meaning, quote, burnt lands within the enclosure of the woods, end quote. The woods themselves were condemned by Moses to be burned wherever the people of God extended their conquests. This was by counsel of divine providence, to the end that those who had already reached the stage of humanity should not again become confounded with the wanderers, who still nefariously held property and women in common. Paragraph 17. There may be seen at the left side of the altar a rudder, symbolizing the origin of the migration of peoples by means of navigation. And by its seeming to bow at the foot of the altar, it symbolizes the ancestors of those who later were the authors of these migrations. These ancestors were at first impious men who recognized no divinity. They were nefarious, since relations among them were not distinguished by marriages, and sons often lay with mothers and fathers with daughters. And finally, because like wild beasts, they had no mind for society in the midst of this infamous communism of possessions, they were all alone, and hence weak and finally miserable and unhappy, because lacking all the goods which are necessary for preservation and security of life. Fleeing the several ills they suffered and the dissensions which this savage communism of possessions produced, and seeking escape and safety, they betook themselves to the cultivated lands of the pious, chaste, strong, and even powerful, that is, of those who were already united in family society. From these lands it will be found cities were called ere, altars, throughout the ancient world of the Gentiles, for they must have been the first altars of the Gentile nations, and the first fire lighted on them was that which served to clear the forest of the trees and bring them under cultivation. And the first water was that of the perennial springs, which were necessary in order that those destined to found humanity should no longer wander in bestial vagrancy in search of water, but settle for a long time in one place and give up vagabondage. And since these altars were evidently the first asylums of the world, which Livy defines generally as the plan of those who founded ancient cities, quote, an old council of founders of cities, end quote, as we are told that within the asylum opened in the grove Romulus founded Rome. Hence the first cities were almost called altars. To this minor discovery let us add a major one, that among the Greeks, from whom, as was said above, we have learned all that we know of Gentile antiquity, the first Thrace or Scythia, i.e. the first North, the first Asia and first India, i.e. the first East, the first Mauritania and Libya, i.e. the first South, and the first Europe or first Hesperia, i.e. the first West, and along with all these the first ocean, were born within Greece itself. And then the Greeks, going abroad in the world, extended these names by analogy to its four parts, and to the ocean that surrounds it. These discoveries, we assert, give new principles to geography, which, like the new principles already promised for chronology, are necessary if we are to read the ideal eternal history above mentioned. For chronology and geography are the two eyes of history. Paragraph 18. To these altars, then, the impious nomadic weak, fleeing for their lives from the stronger, came seeking refuge, and the pious strong killed the violent among them and took the weak under their protection. Since the latter brought with them nothing but their lives, they were accepted as famuli and given means of sustaining life. The family took its name principally from these famuli, whose status roughly approximated that of slaves who came later with the taking of prisoners in war. Hence, like several branches from one trunk, spring the origins, 1. Of the asylums, as we have seen, 2. Of families from which cities later arose, as we shall explain below, 3. Of the founding of cities, that men might live secure from the unjust and violent, 4. Of jurisdictions to be exercised with prescribed territories, 5. Of the extension of empires, which comes by the practice of justice, strength, and magnanimity, which are the most luminous virtues of princes and states. 6. Of family coat of arms, whose first field of arms are found to have stood for the first seed fields. 7. Of fame, from which the family derived their name, and of glory which is eternally inherent in serving the human race. 8. Of true nobility, which arises naturally from the practice of the moral virtues. 9. Of true heroism, which is to put down the proud and give aid to those in danger, in which heroism the Roman people surpassed all other peoples of the earth, and so became master of the world. And lastly, 10. Of war and peace, the former taking its start in the world from self-defense, in which the true virtue of strength consists. In all these origins one can trace the eternal plan of commonwealths, on which states, though acquired by violence and fraud, must take their stand in order to survive, as on the other hand those acquired by way of these virtuous origins afterwards fall to ruin through fraud and violence. This plan of commonwealths is founded on the two eternal principles of this world of nations, namely the mind and the body of the men who compose it. For men consist of these two parts, one of which is noble, and should therefore command, and the other of which is base, and should serve. But because of the corruption of human nature, the generic character of men cannot, without the help of philosophy, which can aid but few, bring it about that every individual's mind should command and not serve his body. Therefore divine providence ordained human things with this eternal order, that in commonwealths those who use their minds should command, and those who use their bodies should obey. Paragraph 19. The rudder bows at the foot of the altar because these famuli, as men without gods, had no share in divine things, and consequently no community, even of human things, with the nobles. Above all, they lacked the right to celebrate solemn nuptials, which the Latins called connubium. The most solemn part of the ceremony was the taking of the auspices, by reason of which the nobles thought themselves to be of divine origin, and held the famuli to be of bestial origin, as generated by nefarious couplings. Bound up with this distinction of nobler nature, we find equally among the Egyptians, Greeks, and Latins a presumed natural heroism, as is more than sufficiently made plain to us in ancient Roman history. Paragraph 20. Finally, the rudder is at some distance from the plow, which is in front of the altar, and displays to the rudder a hostile aspect, menacing it with its point. For the family, having no share, as we have seen, in the ownership of lands, which were all in the hands of the nobles, grew weary of being obliged always to serve their lords. At last, after a long period, they laid claim to the lands and rose in mutiny to enforce the claim, and revolted against the heroes in agrarian contests, which, we shall learn, were much more ancient than and very different from those that we read of later in Roman history. Many leaders of bands of famuli, which had rebelled and been conquered by the heroes, as the serfs of Egypt often were by their priests, according to the observation of Peter van der Kuhn in The Republic of the Hebrews, in order to avoid oppression and to find escape and safety, along with the members of their factions, committed themselves to the hazards of the sea and went in search of unoccupied lands along the shores of the Mediterranean toward the west, where the coasts were not then inhabited. This is the origin of the transmigration of peoples already humanized by religion, starting from the east, Phoenicia above all, and above Egypt, as happened later, for the same reasons in the case of the Greeks. In such wise, not inundations of peoples, which cannot take place by sea, nor the jealous desire of keeping remote acquisitions by means of recognized colonies, since we do not read of any empire of the East or of Egypt or Greece being extended into the West, nor reasons of trade, for the western coasts were not yet inhabited, but rather heroic law made it necessary for such bands of men in these nations to abandon their own lands, a thing which naturally happens only under some extreme necessity. By means of such colonies, which will accordingly be called heroic overseas colonies, the human race was spread abroad in the rest of our world by sea, just as by means of the savage wanderings a long time before it had been spread abroad by land. Paragraph 21. Standing a little further out in front of the plow, there is a tablet inscribed with an ancient Latin alphabet, which, as Tacitus relates, was similar to the ancient Greek, and underneath, the latest alphabet that has come down to us. This tablet symbolizes the origin of the languages and letters that are called vulgar. These are found to have come into being a long time after the founding of the nations, and letters much later than languages. To signify this, the tablet rests on a fragment of a column of the Corinthian order, which came quite late among the architectural orders. Paragraph 22. The tablet lies near the plow and far from the rudder, to signify the origin of native languages, which were first formed each in its own land, where the founders of the nations, scattered and dispersed through the great forest of the earth, as we have said above, finally came together by chance and ceased their bestial wandering. With these native languages, the Eastern or Egyptian or Greek tongues long afterwards mingled, on the occasion of the above-mentioned transmigration of peoples to the shores of the Mediterranean and the ocean. Here we get new principles of etymology, abundantly illustrated throughout this work, by which the origins of native words may be distinguished from those that are unquestionably of foreign origin. The important difference is that native etymologies are histories of things signified by the words in the natural order of ideas. First, the woods, then cultivated fields and huts, next little houses and villages, thence cities, finally academies and philosophers. This is the order of all progress from the first origins. Foreign etymologies, on the other hand, are mere stories of words taken by one language from another. Paragraph 23. The tablet shows only the first letters of the alphabets and lies facing the statue of Homer. For the letters, as Greek tradition tells us of Greek letters, were not all invented at one time. At least, they cannot have all been invented by Homer's time, for we know that he left none of his poems in writing. But of the origin of native languages, more particular information will be given further on. Paragraph 24. Lastly, in the plane most illuminated of all, because the hieroglyphs there displayed represent the most familiar human things, the ingenious artist exhibits in capricious arrangement the Roman fasces, a sword and a purse leaning against the fasces, a balance and the caduceus of Mercury. This is the end of Part 1 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will complete the rest of the introductory material entitled Idea of the Work. Thank you for listening.